And then something major happened in my life that really transformed me in a very, very profound way and somehow charted my course for the rest of my life, both professionally and personally. We were finishing a study of a substance called Malaril, one of the early tranquilizers. And this came from a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Sandoz. And we had a good working relationship with them. And when you do this kind of work for pharmaceutical companies, you get a lot of fringe benefits, sort of free literature, and they might send you to a conference at their expense. And they also send you samples of other drugs that they produce. So in the context of this cooperation, one day we got a large box which was full of ampules, and there was an insert that came with it, and it said in large letters LSD-25. And there was a story described saying that this was a very fascinating substance that was discovered almost by accident or by serendipity, we can say, by Dr. Hoffman, the chemist of Sandoz Laboratories, who worked with ergot alkaloids, trying to develop substances that would be more effective and safer in the treatment of migraine headache and for stopping gynecological bleeding. And as he synthesized this substance, he intoxicated himself by mistake, and he discovered the powerful, mind-altering psychedelic effects of this substance. And then he repeated this in a controlled experiment where he confirmed that actually what he experienced was the effect of the substance. And the substance was tested in a clinical trial in Switzerland, and a paper was published that made it a scientific sensation overnight, practically. And at this point, Sandoz was sending samples to different research institutes and hospitals and private therapists, and they were asking for feedback. Do we see any legitimate use for this substance in psychiatry? And would we sort of experiment with it and give them feedback? There was a suggestion for two possible uses that somehow came out of the early study in Switzerland. One was that maybe the substance could be used as a tool to produce what was called experimental psychosis, that the experience seemed to be similar to what we see in psychotic patients. So we would have the possibility of creating a model of that condition and then study different things before, during, and after, and get insights into the mechanisms that might be involved in psychosis. But there was another suggestion which was even more interesting, and that was that maybe the substance could be used as a kind of unconventional training tool, that psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, students, and so on would have the opportunity to spend several hours in the world of their patients, and as a result of it, be able to understand them better, communicate with them better, and hopefully treat them more effectively. So this was an opportunity I wouldn't have missed for anything in the world. I became an early volunteer and had a very, very profound transforming experience. My preceptor at the time was interested in EEG, not just in LSD, and people who had the sessions with him had to agree to have the EEG before, during, and after. And in addition, he was interested in something that's called driving the brain waves, which is exposing people to optical frequencies, flashing light, stroboscopic light, or to some acoustic frequencies, and then he studied in the corresponding areas of the brain whether the brain waves will pick up the frequency that he was feeding in. So I had to agree that I would not only have the EEG before, during, and after, but that in the middle of the experiment I will get my brain waves driven. And what it meant practically is that when the session was culminating, this research assistant came and said it was time to drive the brain waves. She took me into a little cabin, pasted the electrodes on my scalp, and then asked me to close my eyes, and then brought a giant stroboscopic light, put it above my head, and then turn it on. And in the next moment, I was hit by this incredible source of light, which at the time I was comparing to the epicenter of the atomic explosion in Hiroshima, possibly. Today, I think about it more as something like the Dharmakaya, like the primary clear light that is described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in Bardo Tudo, is something that appears at the time when we die. But basically, my consciousness was catapulted out of my body. I lost a research assistant, and then the clinic, and then Prague, and then the planet. And I had the feeling that my consciousness had absolutely no boundaries, that basically my consciousness became commensurate with the whole universe. And then there were these incredible astronomical events that seemed to be happening again that, later I thought might have been something like black holes, white holes, quasars. This was just an incredible cosmic experience. While this was happening to me, she was following the protocol, going from 2 frequencies to 60, and then slowly back, and then put it in the middle of the alpha band, and then the theta band, and the delta band, and then turn it off. And then my universe started sort of shrinking slowly. I found the planet, and I found Prague, and then I found my body, and I was very impressed by what just happened to me. This was an experience that just generated a lifetime interest in non-ordinary states in me. I thought instantly that this was by far the most interesting thing that one can do in psychiatry, to explore non-ordinary states. So I first joined a group of people who was doing kind of comparative research of different psychedelic substances, not just LSD, but also psilocybin and psilocin, which are alkaloids from the magic mushrooms from Mexico. We also had mescaline, which is the active alkaloid of peyote, a Mexican psychedelic cactus. We also had some of the tryptamine derivatives, which were being developed at the time by a group of researchers in Budapest, like dimethyltryptamine, diethyltryptamine, and so on. And so we were giving these to experimental persons and doing all kinds of psychological, physiological, clinical tests, and then comparing the changes in these people with what we found in people with naturally occurring psychosis. But very quickly I came to the conclusion that I wanted to explore a different aspect of the LSD effect. What I got fascinated by was the tremendous variability of the effect, that if you gave the substance in the same dosage under the same circumstances to 100 experimental subjects, each of them would have a very, very different experience. And if you give it to the same person repeatedly, each of those experiences would be different. And there seemed to be a certain kind of development in the content of the experience. So I started to think about the LSD state not as experimental psychosis, sort of some kind of phantasmagoria that's produced by the interaction between the drug and the physiological processes in the brain, but I started thinking about it as a catalyst, so that processes that are normally in the deep unconscious become manifest. I started thinking about LSD as more like being in the category of some tools for research, like microscope that makes it possible for us to see things that we normally don't see, or a telescope that reveals galaxies that we cannot normally see. So the LSD state for me became something that reveals the deeper dynamics of the psyche way beyond the boundaries of traditional psychoanalysis. And I started a whole other avenue of research, which was basically therapeutic experiments, giving a whole series of sessions to patients who couldn't be helped by any other means, believing that maybe psychoanalysis, aided with this sort of catalyzing effect of LSD, will become clinically so effective as it seemed to be powerful as a conceptual tool. But I was in for a very, very big surprise, in that it became obvious that it was not just the practice of psychoanalysis that needed change, but also the theory, that the dimensions of the psyche that were revealed here were way beyond anything that Freud could ever imagine. Freud talked once about psychoanalysis, comparing it to an iceberg. Before psychoanalysis, we believed that what we are in touch with is the totality of the psyche. And what psychoanalysis revealed is that what we experience consciously is just like the tip of the iceberg, and the rest of it is really hidden and has to be unearthed with the help of free association. And what was coming out of these experiments made it possible to change this kind of simile that Freud was using and say that everything that psychoanalysis has ever discovered was like the tip of the iceberg at best, and that the rest of the psyche that was being revealed in an ordinary state would be like that part of the iceberg that is hidden. Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, used another kind of an image. He said once, when he became aware of the Jungian approach to the psyche, that he realized that Freud was fishing while sitting on a whale,